You are listening to the IoT For All Media Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the IoT For All Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Chacon, and today's we have actually two guests from Pod Group, the CEO, Sam Colley, and Felix Ontañón, the Director of Research and Innovation, both of which have a ton of experience in the IoT space. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Pod Group, they are an enterprise network operator, an ENO, dedicated to providing IoT connectivity solutions to put ownership of the IoT network into the hands of the enterprises by offering managed services on both public and private spectrums. So today we're going to talk a little bit about enterprise network operator, what that means, kind of strategy behind it, why it's important, as well as talking a bit high level around the barriers to adoption, the barriers to deployment that we've seen in IoT and how we can also overcome them. And then we finally wrap up about the new acquisition that they just recently went through and the importance of that and what that kind of means for Pod Group's future. But before we get into that, customers choose Losant because its unique low-code approach to application development offers a level of agility and speed to market that is hard to find anywhere else. Losant provides a foundation and lets you focus on delivering the IoT applications your customers require. Start now and see how the Internet of Things can transform your business. Visit losant.com, LOSANT.com. And without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the IoT For All Podcast. Welcome, Sam and Felix, to the IoT For All Podcast. Thanks for being here this week.
No worries. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'd love it if we could start off. Yeah, absolutely. Let's start off by having you both kind of go around and give a quick introduction about yourself, maybe background, experience, things we think would be really interesting and relevant for our audience to get a better sense of who they're speaking to. And Sam, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So, yes, obviously Sam Colley, and I've been in IoT for 10 years now, I think. So started with Pod in our European office actually, and then kind of moved to the US about 8 years ago, and now on the West Coast, and really kind of been in this connectivity journey pretty much since I guess IoT started to become more mainstream. I mean, it was still M2M, I think, back then, so it was a while back, and certainly there were no billboards with IoT on like there are now, so there was like even less context when people asked what I did.
Sure.
But now I can kind of point to those as you're driving along the highway. But yeah, so I think just been kind of really seeing the evolution, obviously been through the kind of the period of hype around IoT, which obviously hasn't necessarily been achieved yet, but still I think it will be one day once things start coming together. And yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, and I've kind of seen all the different parts of the ecosystem evolve, and seen kind of like the new technologies come along, and it's been really interesting to see that and be part of that. So yeah, that's kind of my background.
Fantastic. Felix?
Mm-hmm. So I'm Felix Ontañón, the Director of Research and Innovation for Pod Group. I'm been in IoT for 8 years, more or less now. Started working for Pod and implementing the first version of the connectivity management platform. That we have. We are having offering the third version of the platform, far way ahead. Of what I started to implement like 8 years ago. So as a director of research and innovation, what I've been trying to do is combining and getting into Pod the most advanced SIM technologies. So today we have EYCC eSIM implemented and the ENO SIM that I think is something we will be maybe discussing today.
Absolutely. Sam, let me throw this question over to you real quick. Just can you talk through the company a little bit more for our audience so they can kind of get a sense of more about Pod Group if, for instance, they aren't as familiar as others are? I'd love to hear just kind of more about the background, the story, and what you all are doing now and kind of the overall focus and impact you have on the IoT space.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, Pod Group has been around in some form or another for nearly over 20 years now. Originally, it was a hardware company in very, very early M2M. So it was actually connected lockbox for deliveries and post people. And I think that was kind of before the age of Amazon. So I think maybe almost like a little ahead of its time. It was like you could unlock it with an SMS. And so they I think turned out not to be too much demand for it. And then about 10, 11 years ago, it kind of moved on from the hardware business and then started to focus on this global connectivity as IoT began to kind of, as I say, really kind of start to scale, and this need for global connectivity or more than just local connectivity became more apparent. And so, so Pod essentially at that moment in time became a global MVNO. in the traditional sense, kind of, working with different carriers and reselling their services. And then really since then, it's really been trying to kind of evolve what it was, in that MVNO space. As Felix mentioned, we kind of really implemented a good CMP very early on, and then that's evolved into something a lot bigger and more impressive now, and really tried to expand globally to make sure we are able to provide a very flexible, nimble connectivity service. And so we now have offices in Spain, UK, California, one in Central America as well, or Mexico, and then also one in Hong Kong. And so really kind of expanded globally to be able to provide that local service around the world. And then beyond that, in the last few years, we've kind of looked at what was happening in the connectivity space and the MVNO space and the MNO space, and kind of looked at what was kind of needed to really achieve the scalability in IoT. And so we've kind of evolved this concept into what we call now the enterprise network operator concept, which is really kind of something new in the market, and it is still very much a concept, but the focus of it is really to deliver ownership of the different elements of IoT to the enterprises so they can manage them directly. So really that's kind of the journey of Pod. And then as we were recently acquired as well by G&D, that ENO concept we really want to evolve into other parts of the ecosystem as well, which maybe we'll talk about a bit later as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were gonna I was planning on talking about the ENO strategy a little bit later, but maybe we can jump into that now since you've kind of segued there a little bit from a background standpoint. And Felix, maybe you can jump in and talk a little bit more about what the enterprise network operator strategy actually is, why it was built, kind of the opportunity that was seen in the market to bring this to light, and then we can dive a little bit more into maybe the benefits and kind of the versus kind of what's out there in the market. And Sam, feel free to jump in at any point as well.
Mm-hmm. So from as Sam said, okay, so basically the strategy with the enterprise network operator, it's providing to the hardware manufacturers, distributors, so the people that are actually at using the connectivity for IoT projects, providing them with all the capabilities that an MVNO like a pod, okay, already have, because we have the control of the connectivity, we have the control of the SIM card, and there's a lot of stuff, okay, a lot of power that even we, okay, as an MVNO, we already have. So providing all that capabilities, so our the hardware manufacturers, distributors, the people that are actually doing the IoT projects, they can benefit and being their own operator. I would say, okay, that's a very good point, okay, from ENO. So one of the aspects is the SIM itself that for a lot of people would believe, okay, that the SIM is just that passive element that you insert into the device for providing you with connectivity, but it is actually a pocket-sized device that the operator control. And that small SIM, it can provide with computational power, cryptographic abilities, and benefiting from that capability the SIM have for implementing applications, embedded applications inside of the SIM card that can solve and help with IoT challenges. It's one of the propositions of the ENO concept under the ENO SIM that we are developing.
And just to expand on that, so really, I think to Felix's point, what the ENO concept really is about, as I mentioned before, delivering the ownership and control to, it could be hardware manufacturers or it could be the enterprises themselves, and that goes, through the platform, the connectivity, the network. And as we've kind of seen the evolution of private networking, particularly in the US, with CBRS, and then in Europe as well, with a big push towards like campus networks and industrial IoT, there's a need for a lot more visibility and control of the network for these enterprises. And so, we've got the SIM card, and I think there's lots of elements on that are needed to really kind of deliver the ENO strategy. Like Felix said, the eSIM element, the cryptographic security element, and then also kind of the idea of zero touch provisioning. But, lots of people talk about that from the perspective of just connectivity, global SIM, zero touch provisioning. But what we're talking about is the ability to basically program your device, like the APN, the ports, the IPs, via the SIM channel securely without having to pre-configure any of it in the device. So, it kind of simplifies the whole supply chain from that perspective as well. And then, as I talked about private networks before, particularly kind of in industrial IoT, there's a big need for local campus networks. Again, in supply chain logistics, it can be big at factories, but there's also this requirement to roam on, roam off, and access the macro networks as well. So, be more than just an island deployment. And so at the core network level, as an enterprise network operator, we've done a lot of integration to allow this roam on, roam off concept at the private and public network level, and then also obviously then deliver all of that in the platform for management by the actual enterprise or hardware manufacturer themselves. So really, that's the kind of example of how an ENO is slightly different, is that it's kind of delivering the control and ownership to the enterprise as opposed to kind of keeping it behind a closed door.
Yeah, and what would most enterprises use that for, or what would they benefit out of being able to do that, as opposed to kind of the existing strategy and offerings out there in the market now?
I mean, each of the different elements, I think, has different benefits. I mean, at the SIM card level and having more control, with eSIM, with zero touch provisioning and things, obviously that's just kind of, simplifying their own supply chain. They don't have to manage multiple SKUs of SIMs. They can truly provision local services on a single global SKU, or they can use global services, and they can then update that remotely. In terms of the SIM applications, the zero touch provisioning. If you imagine you were, as an enterprise, you had 5 applications, each of them, required to speak to different clouds or have different configs on the device. If you have to program those in batches of 2,000, that is one of the biggest challenges actually for IoT, is actually the configuration of these devices, and customizing the configuration. Whereas, if you can just program them all the same way, deliver them to the factory, and when it turns on, it just pulls its config down, via the SIM channel, there's a massive amount of efficiencies there that can be created. And then on the private network side, it's really what we're doing today is private LTE networking, but that's just a precursor to 5G. And I think 5G will, to some extent, probably revolutionize the way that IoT devices are managed, and the ability to slice your network, control, additional security, all in the hands of the enterprise behind their firewall, is hugely advantageous for them. And I think that's something. So the security side is something really that a lot of enterprises have said is kind of almost holding them back from deploying IoT, because of the fear of the consequences of a security breach with all that information.
Could you take me through a little bit about kind of who your target customer and audience is when you're implementing this strategy, and then at the same time, from a use case perspective, what are some use cases that maybe you're comfortable sharing with our audience that your customers and clients are deploying, that you're actively involved in?
Yeah, I think it's pretty broad. I mean, we're relatively horizontal in terms of the use cases for which we work in, but particularly, I think around the ENO, we've been very focused and worked with a lot of SMBs and helped them kind of go from being small companies to scaling into big IoT companies. And we want to continue doing that as we move forward. With the ENO strategy, we've been talking a lot more to some larger enterprises, had some good success in the utility space, for example, where we're working to deliver, particularly on the private networking side, and this kind of ability to migrate from private to public, or public to private even, as private networks are deployed. And then even just kind of as the kind of like traditional businesses like tracking, for example, or logistics kind of evolve, they're becoming slightly more complex in themselves. We're moving into like dash cams and things like that, which require a completely different usage profile. And that's where this control of the SIM remotely to update, cost control for the customer is really important. And then, we're seeing a lot now in retail as well, where again, just the level of control at the local level is really important. So I don't know, Felix, if you've got anything to add to that in terms of where you see the use cases coming in from the device, testing that we've done, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to add a little bit more, okay, on the an additional case, okay, that we have with the ENO SIM. So leveraging the capabilities of the cryptographic elements inside of the SIM card, regardless or beside of the zero-touch provisioning functionality. So the SIM helping devices to download configurations from cloud the first time you switch on. There's another capability that the ENO SIM can help with, and that we are using, okay, with some customers, which is if you want to opt for a cheaper hardware and reducing the manufacturing cost of your device,
Mm-hmm.
but you're going to use cellular connectivity, the SIM card will be there. And the SIM card, it's a cryptographic chip. So on the ENO SIM, what we have implemented is an embedded application inside on the SIM card, so the device can send the temperature sensor, humidity, whatever, okay, the measurement. The SIM card encrypts the data and orders the module, the device, to upload the measurement encrypted to the cloud. That way, you do not have to implement the HTTP and TLS crypto connectivity stack on your device firmware, because the SIM card will be there and that can implement that part, releasing more capabilities of your devices for doing more smart stuff with sensors or for opting for cheaper hardware. So if you are opting for cellular connectivity and concerned about the device manufacturing expenses, why not take leveraging that capabilities of the crypto chip with SIM card S?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you guys for kind of diving into that a little bit more. I was very curious to kind of understand how that all works, how it's being applied, and kind of how it compares to what's going on in the market now from an offering perspective. So that's great. I did want to break off from that just briefly. We might come back to it in a second, but talk a little bit more high level about a topic I think would be really interesting to get your all's perspective on, and that's just if we look at the IoT market and where it's come. I know, Sam, you've been involved in the space for a very long time. If we can talk about the barriers that you all have seen through your experiences, regarding what has really prevented IoT from reaching its full potential. There's been a lot of projections on how many deployments we're going to have, how kind of adoption is going to look like, and so forth. But there are a lot of different barriers that are kind of restricting that from happening. Whether it's the market being kind of at times very fragmented, the technology seeming complex, you name it. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting kind of angles that you all could kind of approach this from. So I'd love it if, Sam, you could kind of start us off by just talking through what barriers you've seen throughout your experience and currently now to IoT really reaching those projected deployment numbers and adoption that we've kind of been promised for so many years. Sam,
Sorry.
Sorry,
yeah. And yes, I think you touched on a couple of really important ones just then, in terms of like the fragmentation and things like cost. And I think, they're starting to be addressed now, but not necessarily completely. And we're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel in many ways, but there's still a lot of confusion, I think, in terms of the communication that's used, the terminology that's used. I mean, if we just look at the term eSIM alone, like it can be used in 5 different ways to mean 5 different things. It can mean just the eSIM on the actual, the physical SIM card. It can mean, the technology. It can mean a profile, and really will never been clear communication around, how terminology should be used. And that, we get questions from customers, and it takes a while to educate them on that, and for them to really understand the power of what eSIM actually is, or UICC actually is. And then the same kind of confusion applies to network technologies, NB-IoT, CAD-M, is it globally deployed? No. Can you access it anywhere? No. And yet that's not really it's communicated as the future, but not necessarily, people aren't necessarily told that, this isn't available in every country. If you want a global application, you're going to need some level of 2G fallback. And yet, they're 90% of the way through their device kind of build and development. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, I need to rethink this. And, there's still a lot of, I think, poor and confusing communication by a lot of different providers out there, for sure. I think some of the standards have been somewhat underwhelming as well, just in terms of like the implementation at the GSMA level maybe. And when you look at how even EUICC was standardized initially, it's kind of the reliance on SMS is kind of interesting. And is that a technology that we should be relying on when the future is data? And is that holding things back because it makes the deployment somewhat clunky, and those sorts of things as well? I mean, they're kind of very small things in a big market, but they're important when it comes to scalability and adoption, I think. But in terms of the broader things, I think fragmentation is huge. There's new technologies, new platforms every day, and hardware, software, and connectivity really needs to be talking to each other constantly, and that all the data coming off it and the way that they interact needs to be seamless. And I think that's one of the big things that we're looking to kind of address moving forward. And we feel that as a connectivity provider, we can sit perfectly in the middle there and almost orchestrate between these platforms. And the device management piece that the ENO SIM brings is our first step towards moving into that. So I think that and interoperability, there's so many things we could talk about for probably 25 minutes alone. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Now let me ask you, when you all work with companies, and this is something that we haven't really covered too much about, we maybe touched on here and there, but when a company adopts IoT, there's a certain kind of skill set and certain understanding of the technology that often is required by that customer, by the end user, and so forth. How have you seen that play into barriers for adoption? I mean, obviously, you can go down the path of talking about just the resistance from a legacy standpoint or legacy infrastructure standpoint, but I'm thinking more along the lines of individual knowledge skills that are needed within an organization to help these IoT solutions be not just adopted, but also utilized to their fullest extent. And as the company grows, how they can kind of expand on that. And I feel like that's a skill set that's really required within an organization to truly benefit. I'd be curious to kind of get your thoughts on kind of how you see it.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think, one of the things we did some work with one of the analysts a few years ago, and that's really one of the reasons the ENO strategy also came about, is the lack of these expertise or in-house knowledge of how to digitize or implement networks and platforms, etc., to really manage and scale IoT within their own company or their own enterprise. And so I think it is a huge challenge because it is an additional budget that lots of people don't necessarily consider. They want the benefits and cost savings of IoT and the efficiencies, but maybe they haven't got the initial budget to invest. And I think with the ENO strategy or ENO strategy and the platform that we're trying to build is to try and take a lot of that administrative burden or internal requirement, in-house requirement off the enterprise and kind of deliver them with a much more seamless kind of I guess IoT management platform eventually, so that you don't quite need the same level of expertise, right? You don't need someone to manage 5 different things. You can have one person managing all of that essentially, via a single pane of glass. And I think it's a real challenge for enterprises, I think, and it is probably another one of the reasons that there's been lots of stops and starts, right? Enterprises dipping their toes, realizing maybe they're not equipped, and then pulling back because maybe they're not 100% convinced of the value and return when they have to make that investment. I don't know, Felix, if you've got anything to add there from a more technical perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, what I think is that implementing an IoT project, it requires a variety actually of skills. First, you need the domain knowledge of the problem you are trying to solve. So the IoT vertical, either is agriculture or tracking, positioning, utilities, industrial, that's very necessary because you're implementing an IoT project for solving a business problem or an enterprise problem, actually. Along with that, from my perspective, I think that some companies has more that are implementing the IoT projects, they are more focused into building the cloud solution. Then they are lacking the connectivity knowledge and the connectivity challenges. They perceive connectivity as a commodity, maybe, if they are if they are focused into implementing the cloud solution or the IoT application on the cloud. Then, if the company is more focused into distributing the hardware for solving different vertical solutions or for different vertical solutions, they are lacking the knowledge on the connectivity as well, and maybe on the IoT application development. So it's like a 3 or 4, even 4 different skill sets, that would be needed, from my perspective. Domain of knowledge, hardware, connectivity, and the platform and software, on the cloud.
Right.
From pod, I think that we are covering very well, the connectivity part and also the additional knowledge that we offer to our customers because we know, about the hardware. We care about the hardware of our customers, and we
Right.
accommodate the connectivity to their own hardware when onboarding them, helping us to fill that part. And I think that that's key, for companies in the IoT to provide not only your part of the knowledge, but being aware, that there's too many different skill sets, and the more you have, mm, the more adequate solution or service you will be able to provide, to your partners slash customers.
Absolutely. I think the understanding that yes, a lot of these technologies are complex. The market at times is fragmented, depending on how you look at it. But there's a lot of emphasis to be put on the power and the impact of working with a company like Pod Group and others who really understand the IoT side of it, the connectivity side, the hardware side. People work with systems integrators who are kind of in charge of understanding it all. But that the partnership side of things, I think, is what's really driven this community or this industry forward for so many years. And there's a lot of, I think, to be said about the importance of that when companies are out there looking to go find a company to work with, is who has the right partners, who has the right understanding of the full scale of a solution that needs to be developed. Now, one thing you mentioned was the domain authority, which I think is very important as well. But oftentimes that comes from the customer because they're the ones living in that space and they're the experts there. So understanding how to really digest that information from them and collect the right information from them in order to help advise them on the right path forward, so that the pieces that are put together for a solution are correctly chosen, whether it's to meet a certain ROI or some kind of objective internally for them. Because for them, if they don't have if they can't justify from an ROI perspective, or they can't get the right buy-in from upper management, it's sometimes that's where it kind of dies at the pilot stage, along with many other reasons as to why that happens. But Sam, I wanted to ask you, what do you think we need to be thinking about, or the industry needs to see, for a lot of these barriers to be removed or start to kind of fall down a bit for us to be able to see adoption increase? We've kind of talked a lot about what those barriers are, but from your perspective, in addition to what you all are doing, are there other things in the industry you think that need to happen for adoption to kind of grow and those deployments to be more successful?
Yeah, I think it kind of touches on some of what we talked about before, but I do think, to your point, like partnerships are really key. I think this idea of interoperability, you don't,
Mm-hmm.
as a company like Pod Group, we're not going to necessarily own every element of the stack. We're not going to build our own IoT platform. There's so many out there already that are doing a great job.
Sure.
But as a customer or as an enterprise, they need to be able to kind of like manage that pretty seamlessly, either from the IoT platform, they need to manage their connectivity from there, and their devices from there, and possibly even their hardware from there, or they need to be able to do it from, say, the kind of CMP that we're providing. And so I think, building these partnerships and these kind of integrations across the three main silos, and breaking it down into super basic level, but like hardware, software, and connectivity,
Right.
as I mentioned before, they really do need to be kind of like talking to each other very seamlessly, and it can't be a lot of work for the enterprise to do that, because to your point, the technical expertise internally may not be there for them to be able to go and build all of those integrations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a real challenge. I mean, we do it for a living, and it's a challenge, and so
For
for
sure.
someone just to come and be jump in there and try and pull it together is even more difficult. So I do believe that these partnerships are needed. I think that ecosystem needs to be open. I think it needs to be agnostic. I don't think any one party can say you have to use us for this and we're not allowing you any flexibility in that, because if that's the case, then you start creating like micro silos, and then this interoperability is still lost. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I think the MNOs are really starting to see that with eSIM, that they really need to kind of be less protective over the network, and if they're delivering a good quality network and the at prices that allow IoT to scale, they will be successful even in the world of eSIM, where maybe it's slightly easier for someone to move away from them, but then it puts the accountability on them to deliver the right service at the right price to the customer, so they can scale their IoT. And so I think
Absolutely.
there's a
Okay.
lot. Oh, sorry, Ryan, go on.
No, go ahead and finish. Sorry.
Yes, there's just a lot around, I think, that really, and I think that's the first step really, is just kind of creating these partnerships, this interoperability, this kind of open, kind of agnostic type approach to it, and that's one of the things we kind of believe quite heavily in. And I think there's no single, and people say it all the time, but there's no like single answer to fix all one single problem. And so really it's kind of opening the eyes of the enterprise to all the different potential services that are available, so that they can pick best in class for what they're trying to achieve for a specific application, but not have to use a different provider, a different platform, have a different supplier, but can access it via partnerships or whatever else.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there was a point you made about what companies that you work with not only come in understanding, but also want to know or need to know to be successful. And I think the easier we can make that buying process, and the earlier the more knowledge they can come into a conversation with a company like you all, with at least a base level understanding of what's going on, but then know that the trust, or put the trust in you all to put this together, build it, take care of the thing, so that they can get back to operating their business and they can start seeing the benefits of the solution that would be then developed and deployed within their organization or for their customers. I think it's very important to also consider is how we are um, educating them, the potential customers, but at the same time making the adoption as easy as possible for them, because the last thing they want is another system that they have to work with that creates headaches and that drives up costs for them in any kind of capacity. So I think those points are very, very valid. And the last thing I wanted to ask you all before we wrapped up here is, let's tie back the ENO strategy that you have and into those barriers that we're talking about. Which ones does the ENO strategy really address in your mind, or kind of where was it, I guess, initially built to address to help bring down some of those key barriers that you are able to have influence over?
Yeah, and I think that the ENO strategy, the concept as well, will evolve over time. Initially, we've developed it,
Sure.
Primarily to look at the connectivity silo, right? All of these kind of disparate technologies within that, as I say, private networks, eSIM, multi-IMSI to some extent, global connectivity, all these things, and then even the various different types of pricing models and the billing and administration of those that are needed, whether it's a 2-month bundle, a year-long bundle, a monthly bundle, or all these sorts of things that also weren't really being addressed. So initially the ENO was kind of just built or designed to really simplify the connectivity silo, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But then as obviously we progress with that implementation, you start to touch things like device management, and that's where the ENO SIM comes into it, which Felix talked about before. And so then you start to solve these problems that aren't necessarily directly related to connectivity themselves, but you can start to solve incrementally within the same platform as, say, the connectivity management. And then as we've kind of gone down the path of zero touch provisioning, we started the engagement with more IoT platforms, and so what level of integration is required within an IoT platform for a customer to be able to use the IoT platform to successfully manage their services. So sort of started to look at things from the perspective of the enterprise first, and then look at what we can deliver as a service from the platform point of view. So I think where it will evolve to is probably very different to what the concept is today, but it's trying to move the conversation away from megabytes and minutes when people talk to us, and how can we kind of help them solve other problems within their stacks that are somewhat related but not actually connectivity. I'm not sure if that answered your question, to be honest, Ryan, but
no, absolutely. I mean, I think anything that we can do to help understand and help showcase things that are being done to bring down those barriers to adoption, to those barriers to deployment. And I think even some companies are very niche focused and some are more broad focused on what they're able to provide to bring to the market to help that. So I think what you all are doing is fantastic and really helping bring down some of those barriers to adoption, and help companies really understand, especially on the connectivity side, what's going on and what's best for their solutions. So that's fantastic. So the last thing I wanted to ask you before we as we finish up here is two things. One is, as our listeners out there or watchers, now that we're on video, have more questions, want to follow up, engage further, what's the best way to do that? Is it through email? Is it through LinkedIn? Is there some process you like to push them towards?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a contact form on the website, podgroup.com, where people can kind of, put their details in, and then we'll reach out to them. But also, yeah, I mean, any of us available on LinkedIn, direct messages are always welcome. And then also we do have 24/7 phone line that goes straight to like an account manager, and you can just call us and we'll be happy to help you that way as well. So pretty pretty much any way you like to contact us, you can do it, or just direct email as well. I think it's pretty
Okay.
easy to do that. So.
Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to ask is just, what does the future look like on your end? I know we've touched on it with the ENO strategy and the potential there, but just generally as a company, I know you all were, I believe, recently acquired, correct? And what does that kind of do, or how does that impact kind of the future plans for what you have going on?
Yeah, so we were acquired by G&D, obviously, one of the leaders in eSIM and SIM cards and security in the market today. I think they have more eSIM platforms deployed than any other provider in the world. And I think, they were really interested in this ENO strategy and also looking, they've got a great vision of, beyond just what they're doing today as well. And I think what initially that acquisition gives us is complete ownership of the connectivity stack from the SIM OS, from the plastic itself, all the way through to the core network that we've implemented, and then also the management platform that sits on top of that. So, the amount of kind of technology we can evolve, a bit like the ENO SIM that Felix was talking about, and control over the app that's on the SIM, and control over the eSIM platform, and starting to kind of, I guess, innovate around the existing standards today to deliver more value to the market is kind of, I guess, phase one. But then into the future, we're really looking beyond, as I say, just the connectivity piece and looking at how we can really help deliver, value, be it at a hardware level or an additional software level, in order to kind of ease the enterprise's burden and really accelerate this growth that we know IoT can achieve, but is still somewhat behind the expectations. Felix, I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
Well, maybe for the future, one of the holy grails, that a lot of people is looking for, it's the convergence of a lot of different technologies into something more easy. So, as you said, Ryan, that people can benefit from out of the shelf, from all this everything, on IoT. So one particular aspect, on the SIM card itself is like that I believe that it can play a very good role. It's not only me, obviously, who thinks that, in converging device identity, device connectivity, and device payments. Have a look. The smart card, in the end, the smart card can be the SIM card for connectivity, an ID card for identity, the credit card for payments. In the end, it's the same chip.
Yeah.
It's software only. What makes a smart card for payments. So I foresee, given some research groups and interest groups that are already, and even from some movements of the GSMA, that something that we might see in the future is that the SIM card itself, it's turned into a convergence small unit that can host inside all software. So hardware can benefit from making connectivity, identity, and payments, everything inside of the SIM. I wish, from Pod, and now that we are by the hand of G&D, as well, we can help, in standardizing some of this convergence stuff and providing that for the worldwide audience. That will be great. That part of our interest and the stuff we are making products, and research now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for that. I think, I'm very excited to kind of see what comes out of Pod Group, G&D, kind of as we progress here now that you all are acquired by them. And I think a lot of the things we talked about today are super fascinating that you have going on. So very excited for our audience out there. Please check out Pod Group, see what they're doing. Reach out if you have any questions or want to consider working with them in some capacity. But gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I think this conversation was fantastic, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having us, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Really,
it's great chatting to you.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for watching that episode of the IoT For All podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please click the thumbs up button, subscribe to our channel, and be sure to hit the bell notification so you get the latest episodes as soon as they become available. Other than that, thanks again for watching, and we'll